My sister laughed at my ticket until the man in uniform spoke my name. I never thought I would be betrayed by someone I loved, especially not in front of so many people. But there I was, standing in the crowded airport terminal, clutching my boarding pass like it was the last piece of dignity I had left, while my sister Emma's laughter echoed in my ears like a cruel symphony. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the way my sister laughed. I never thought she could hurt me like that, but what I didn't realize was how much deeper her betrayal went. The sound wasn't the warm, familiar laugh I'd grown up with during our childhood tea parties and late-night movie marathons. This was different, sharp, calculated, designed to cut. "Isabella, you actually think you belong in first class?" she had said, loud enough for the other passengers to hear. "Look at you. Look at your clothes, your cheap handbag. You're embarrassing yourself." I felt my cheeks burn as heads turned in our direction. The businessman in the expensive suit raised an eyebrow. The woman with the designer luggage smirked. Even the teenager with his nose buried in his phone glanced up to witness my shame. In that moment, I wasn't Isabella Rodriguez, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to afford this trip. I wasn't the person who had saved every penny for 2 years to surprise our grandmother for her 90th birthday. I was just Emma's little sister, the one who didn't quite measure up. As I stood there, feeling invisible, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to let this define me, or I could choose to change everything. The weight of years of similar moments pressed down on my shoulders. Emma's subtle digs at family dinners, her way of making me feel small during important conversations, the countless times she had positioned herself as the successful one while I remained in the shadows.
But something was different this time.
Maybe it was the public nature of her cruelty, or maybe it was the fact that I had worked so hard to earn my place on that plane. Whatever it was, a small flame of defiance began to flicker in my chest. I thought about the ticket in my hand, not just a piece of paper, but proof of my determination, my sacrifice, my worth. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and I watched Emma stride confidently toward the gate, her designer heels clicking against the floor with an arrogance that made my stomach twist. She didn't even look back to see if I was following. She assumed, as she always had, that I would trail behind her like a lost puppy, grateful for whatever scraps of attention she threw my way. I didn't know how it would unfold, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. Will I choose to stay silent, or will I take control of my own story? Standing there in that terminal, watching Emma disappear into the crowd, I couldn't help but think about all the times before this one. The airport incident wasn't an isolated moment of cruelty. It was just the latest chapter in a book I'd been writing my whole life, one where I always played the supporting character in my own story. I remembered my high school graduation. While other families celebrated with pride, Emma had spent the entire dinner telling our relatives about her latest promotion, her new apartment, her successful boyfriend. When I tried to mention my acceptance into community college, something I'd worked so hard for, she had smiled that same calculating smile and said, "Well, we can't all be academic stars, can we? At least Isabella is trying." The words were wrapped in false encouragement, but the damage was surgical and precise. Then there was my 25th birthday party. I had saved for months to host it at a nice restaurant, wanting to feel special for once. Emma arrived an hour late, immediately announcing her engagement to the entire room. Suddenly, my birthday became her engagement celebration. I found myself congratulating her while my own cake sat forgotten on the table, candles melting into colorful puddles of wax. When I tried to express how I felt later, she looked genuinely confused. "But Isabella, isn't this wonderful news? I thought you'd be happy for me." That was Emma's specialty, making her cruelty look like oversight, her selfishness appear accidental. She had perfected the art of emotional theft, taking my moments and making them hers while somehow making me feel guilty for wanting them back. Over the years, I'd learned to expect less, to make myself smaller, to save her the trouble of having to eclipse me. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliations. It was the private moments when I'd catch her watching me with something that looked almost like pity. Like she felt sorry for me for being who I was, her lesser sister. The one who tried but never quite succeeded. The one who dreamed small because she'd learned to expect disappointment. I thought about our mother's funeral 3 years ago. Emma had given the eulogy, speaking beautifully about our family, our childhood, our mother's love. But in her version of our story, I barely existed. She painted a picture of herself as the devoted daughter, the one who had carried our mother's hopes and dreams. I sat in the front pew, listening to my own life being erased, wondering if I had imagined my late-night conversations with Mom, the times she'd held me when Emma's words cut too deep. After the service, people approached Emma with sympathy and praise for her moving words. I stood beside her, invisible as always, until our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chin, took my hand and whispered, "Your mother was so proud of your kindness, Isabella. She told me how you visited her every Tuesday, how you'd read to her when her eyes got tired." In that moment, I realized that some people had seen me, even if Emma hadn't. But those moments of validation were rare. Most of the time, I existed in Emma's shadow, believing that maybe she was right. Maybe I was the lesser sister, the one whose dreams were too small, whose achievements didn't matter. Can I confront the hidden wounds, or will they remain buried forever? Something shifted in me as I stood in that airport terminal, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed my humiliation. Maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Chen's words, or maybe it was finally reaching the breaking point after years of accepting Emma's version of who I was supposed to be. But for the first time in my life, I felt a surge of something I'd almost forgotten existed within me: anger. Not the sad, defeated kind of anger that turns inward and eats away at your soul. This was different, clean, sharp, and surprisingly energizing. It was the kind of anger that says enough and means it. I looked down at my boarding pass again. First class, seat 2A. I had earned this ticket through months of double shifts at the diner, weekends spent tutoring kids in math instead of relaxing, and countless nights of saying no to invitations because every dollar was precious. This wasn't charity or luck. This was the result of my determination to do something meaningful for Grandma Rosa's 90th birthday. Emma had no idea about the sacrifices I'd made. She didn't know about the nights I'd fallen asleep at my kitchen table, surrounded by bills and calculator, figuring out how to make this trip possible. She couldn't imagine that her lesser sister had the discipline and drive to save $3,000 while working minimum wage jobs. In her mind, I was still the little girl who needed her approval, her permission to take up space in the world. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I pulled out my phone and, for the first time in years, I didn't call Emma to apologize or to smooth things over. Instead, I called Grandma Rosa. Her voice, warm and familiar, filled me with something I hadn't felt in so long: pride in myself. "Mija, are you calling from the airport?" "Oh, how exciting. I still can't believe you're flying first class to see me." When I told the ladies at bingo, they were so impressed. "Your Isabella is such a good granddaughter," they said. What a successful young woman. Successful. The word hit me like a revelation. Grandma Rosa saw me as successful. Not because I had Emma's corner office or designer clothes, but because I had saved money through hard work and sacrifice to show my love in a meaningful way. Why had I never seen myself through her eyes instead of Emma's? After hanging up, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't going to chase after Emma. I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space or for daring to treat myself to first class. I wasn't going to spend this trip walking on eggshells, trying to avoid her disapproval. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to act like I belonged exactly where I was. I walked to the gate with my head high, my cheap handbag slung over my shoulder like armor. When the gate agent called for first-class passengers to board, I stepped forward without hesitation. I didn't look around for Emma's approval or brace myself for another cutting comment. I simply presented my ticket and walked down the jet bridge like I owned it. The flight attendant, a kind-faced woman with silver hair, smiled warmly as she directed me to my seat. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Rodriguez. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Ms. Rodriguez. Not Emma's little sister. Not the girl who didn't quite measure up. Just Isabella Rodriguez, first-class passenger, granddaughter on a mission of love. As I settled into my leather seat and accepted the pre-flight champagne, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that I might actually like the person I was becoming. Can I find the courage to change my life, or will I hesitate when it matters most? As the plane lifted off, I found myself doing something I'd never done before, planning my next move instead of simply reacting to whatever Emma threw at me. The champagne had given me a warm, confident feeling, but it was more than alcohol courage. For the first time, I was thinking strategically about how to handle my sister. I pulled out the small notebook I always carried, the same one where I'd tracked every dollar saved for this trip, and began to write. Not the emotional ramblings of a hurt sister, but a clear-headed assessment of the situation. Emma thrived on my predictable responses, my tears, my apologies, my desperate attempts to win back her approval. What if I simply stopped giving her what she expected? I knew Emma well enough to predict her next moves. She would arrive in Miami already crafting the story she'd tell our extended family, how I'd embarrass myself at the airport, how she'd try to save me from humiliation, how I was always so sensitive and dramatic. By the time I arrived, she'd have positioned herself as the victim of my unreasonable behavior. But this time, I had something she didn't expect. Information. During those long nights of working extra shifts, I'd spent my breaks researching our family history for Grandma Rosa's birthday celebration. I'd discovered things Emma didn't know I knew, like the scholarship fund Grandma had quietly established in my name at the community college, or the letters Grandma had saved from my elementary school teachers, praising my kindness and creativity. Even more interesting were the conversations I'd had with our cousins, aunts, and uncles while planning this surprise visit. It turned out that many of them had their own stories about Emma's behavior over the years. Cousin Maria had confided that Emma once took credit for the Christmas cookies Maria spent days making for a family gathering. Aunt Carmen mentioned how Emma had a habit of steering conversations away from other people's accomplishments. Uncle Luis had quietly asked me once if Emma ever let me talk during family dinners because he'd noticed how she interrupted me. I wasn't the only one who had been affected by Emma's need to be the center of attention. But I might be the first one willing to do something about it. My plan was simple, but surgical. I wouldn't confront Emma with tears or accusations. That would only give her ammunition to paint me as the unstable sister. Instead, I would let her reveal herself. I would stand in my truth, share my genuine experiences, and simply stop enabling her narrative control. When she tried to diminish my achievements, I would calmly state the facts. When she attempted to take credit for things that weren't hers, I would politely correct the record. When she interrupted me, I would continue speaking. Most importantly, I would share the real story of how this trip came to be, the months of sacrifice, the careful planning, the love that motivated every dollar saved. Not as a bid for sympathy, but as a statement of fact. Let the family decide for themselves what they thought about a granddaughter who worked 3 jobs to afford a first-class trip for her grandmother's 90th birthday. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't plotting elaborate revenge or dramatic confrontations. I was simply deciding to stop hiding who I really was to make Emma more comfortable. Will I feel victorious when it's over, or will the consequences leave me feeling empty? The moment I walked into Grandma Rosa's living room, I could see that Emma had already begun laying the groundwork for her version of events. She was positioned near the center of the room, surrounded by our aunts and cousins, her hands moving expressively as she spoke in that practiced tone of concerned, sisterly love. So embarrassing for her, you know? I tried to help, but Isabella was just so defensive about everything. I worry that she's taking on too much, working all those jobs. Sometimes I think the stress is getting to her. It was masterful, really. Emma had managed to position herself as the caring sister while simultaneously questioning my mental stability, all wrapped in what sounded like genuine concern. In the past, I would have felt my cheeks burn, would have stammered some explanation that only made me look more unstable. But not today. Emma, I said calmly, walking over to kiss Grandma Rosa's cheek before addressing the room. I'm glad you're sharing your concerns about my stress levels. It's true, working 3 jobs to save for this trip was exhausting. But I wouldn't trade a single shift for anything. Being able to surprise Grandma Rosa with a first-class trip for her 90th birthday has been worth every sacrifice. The room went quiet. I could see Emma's eyes narrow slightly as she recalculated, realizing that her narrative had just been redirected. "Of course," she said quickly. "We're all grateful for Isabella's gesture. Though I still think economy would have been perfectly first class." Aunt Carmen interrupted, looking at me with raised eyebrows. "Isabella Mija, you flew first class?" "I did," I said simply. "I wanted this trip to be special for Grandma. She saved for over a year," Grandma Rosa said proudly from her chair, reaching for my hand. "3 jobs, can you imagine? And she never said a word about how hard she was working. I only found out when Mrs. Morales at the bank told me about all the deposits Isabella was making." I watched Emma's face as the room's attention shifted. This wasn't part of her script. In her version, I was the irresponsible sister who had somehow gotten lucky with an upgrade, not the granddaughter who had worked tirelessly to make this moment possible. "Well," Emma said, her voice slightly sharper now, "I'm sure Isabella meant well, but honestly, spending that kind of money when she could have used it for what?" I asked gently, genuinely curious about where she was going with this. Emma faltered for a moment. "For 4 practical things. A better apartment, maybe. Or saving for your future instead of honoring our grandmother?" I finished. "I appreciate your concern about my finances, Emma, but I'm quite comfortable with my choices." Cousin Maria laughed softly. "Emma, what are you talking about? This is beautiful. Isabella, I wish I had thought to do something like this for my grandmother before she passed." "The scholarship," Uncle Luis said suddenly, looking at Grandma Rosa. "Mommy, didn't you tell me you set up some kind of scholarship fund? Wasn't that for Isabella?" I felt a warm flush of surprise. I hadn't planned to bring up the scholarship. I'd only discovered it recently while helping Grandma organize her papers. "Aye, Luis," Grandma Rosa said, waving her hand dismissively but with obvious pride. "I didn't want to make a big fuss. But yes, Isabella's kindness inspired me to establish a scholarship for students like her, ones who work hard but don't always get recognition for it." The silence that followed was different from before. I could feel the shift in the room's energy, could see my family members looking at me with something I hadn't experienced in years: respect. Emma, meanwhile, was struggling to regain control of the narrative. "That's wonderful, Grandma, but I think we should focus on celebrating your birthday rather than celebrating the granddaughter who made this party possible," Aunt Carmen said pointedly. For the first time in my memory, Emma had no response. She stood there, her mouth slightly open, as the family she had always commanded looked at her with something approaching disappointment. Will I feel relieved after this, or will it leave me questioning everything? That evening, as the family celebration wound down and everyone began to say their goodbyes, I found myself sitting alone on Grandma Rosa's back porch, staring up at the Miami stars and trying to process what had just happened. The confrontation had gone exactly as I'd planned, better, even. Emma had been exposed, the family had seen the truth, and I had finally stood up for myself. So, why did I feel so hollow? I had imagined this moment for months during those long work shifts. In my fantasies, standing up to Emma would feel triumphant, liberating, like finally stepping into the sunlight after years in the shadows. But the reality was more complicated. Yes, there was satisfaction in seeing Emma speechless, in watching our family's perception of me shift from pity to respect. But there was also something that felt uncomfortably like loss. The truth was, even after all her cruelty, Emma was still my sister. The same person who had taught me to braid my hair when I was 7, who had held my hand during our father's funeral, who used to sneak me extra cookies when our mother wasn't looking. Watching her struggle tonight, seeing her usual confidence crumble, I had felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been sympathy. Was that wrong of me? After years of emotional manipulation, was I supposed to feel guilty for finally fighting back? Inside the house, I could hear Emma's voice, quieter now, talking to Grandma Rosa. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different, less commanding, more uncertain. Part of me wanted to go inside and check on her, to fall back into the familiar pattern of being the sister who smoothed things over, who made everyone comfortable. But another part of me knew that would be a betrayal of everything I'd worked for tonight. My phone buzzed with a text from Cousin Maria. "I'm so proud of you tonight, Isabella. It's about time someone called Emma out on her behavior. You were amazing." Amazing. The word should have felt good, but instead it left me with more questions. Had I been amazing, or had I simply been calculating? Was standing up for myself the same thing as tearing someone else down? The line between justice and revenge suddenly seemed thinner than I'd thought. I thought about Emma's face when Aunt Carmen had confronted her, the way her usual mask of confidence had slipped to reveal something that looked almost vulnerable. For a split second, I had seen not the sister who had tormented me for years, but the girl who had always felt she had to be perfect, who had learned to take up all the space in the room because she was afraid there wouldn't be enough attention to go around. That realization hit me like a cold wave. What if Emma's cruelty hadn't just been about power, but about fear? What if she had been just as damaged by our family dynamics as I had been, but had chosen to become the aggressor instead of the victim? The thought made me uncomfortable because it complicated my narrative. It was easier to see Emma as purely villainous, to cast myself as the righteous underdog finally getting her due. But families are rarely that simple, and pain rarely has such clean lines. I heard the screen door creak behind me and turned to see Grandma Rosa settling into the chair beside me, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Big day," she said softly. "Yes," I agreed, not sure what else to say. "You know," Grandma Rosa continued, "I've been watching you girls your whole lives. Watching how you hurt each other, how you love each other. Tonight was necessary. But Mija, revenge is like medicine. It can heal, but it can also poison if you take too much." I looked at her, this wise woman who had seen so much, who had loved us both through all our flaws and failures. "I don't know if what I did tonight was healing or poison, Grandma." She reached over and patted my hand. "That's why you're asking the question, Mija. That means you still have room in your heart for something more than anger. Has revenge really brought me peace, or is there more healing to be done?" The next morning, I woke up in Grandma Rosa's guest room with sunlight streaming through the white lace curtains and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. During the night, something had shifted, not just in how I saw Emma, but in how I saw myself. I realized that the most powerful moment of the previous evening hadn't been when Emma was silenced, or when the family finally saw her behavior for what it was. It had been that quiet moment on the airplane when the flight attendant called me Ms. Rodriguez, when I was seen simply as myself, not as someone's little sister or someone's disappointment. For 28 years, I had defined myself in relation to Emma. I was the sister who wasn't as successful, the one who tried but never quite measured up, the one who needed to work 3 times as hard for half the recognition. Even my plan for revenge had been about Emma, about proving her wrong, about changing how she saw me. But sitting in Grandma Rosa's kitchen that morning, sipping coffee from the same blue mug I'd used as a child, I understood something that felt revolutionary. Emma's opinion of me had never been the real problem. The real problem was that I had made her opinion more important than my own. I thought about the scholarship fund Grandma had established, not because Emma had suggested I deserved recognition, but because Grandma had seen my worth with her own eyes. I thought about Mrs. Chun at the funeral, who had noticed my Tuesday visits with Mom. I thought about my students at the tutoring center, who lit up when I helped them understand a difficult math concept. All these people had seen value in me that had nothing to do with Emma's assessment. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to afford this trip wasn't lesser than anyone. She was determined, generous, and strong. The granddaughter who had surprised her family with this celebration wasn't trying to prove anything. She was expressing love in the most tangible way she knew how. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos from last night's party. In every single one, I looked happy. Not the anxious, people-pleasing version of happiness I usually wore around family, but genuine joy. I was laughing with my cousins, hugging Grandma Rosa, sharing stories about my students. In these pictures, I looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. When Emma appeared in the kitchen an hour later, looking uncharacteristically subdued, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the triumphant piece of victory, but the deeper piece of someone who no longer needed to win. "Isabella," she said quietly, pouring herself coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "About yesterday at the airport." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see my oppressor or my critic. I saw a woman who had built her identity around being the successful sister, who had needed me to be less so she could feel like more. I saw someone who was probably just as trapped by our family dynamics as I had been, but who had chosen a different prison. "Emma," I said gently, "I forgive you." She stopped stirring her coffee and looked up at me with something like shock. "But I haven't even apologized yet." "I know," I said. "I'm not forgiving you for you. I'm forgiving you for me. Because holding on to that anger was keeping me small, and I'm tired of being small." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds possibility, that suggests new beginnings might be within reach. "I don't know how to do this," Emma said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "How to be your sister without needing to be better than you." For the first time, I heard vulnerability in Emma's voice instead of calculation. And for the first time, I felt strong enough to respond with compassion instead of defensiveness. "Maybe we can figure it out together," I said. "But Emma, I need you to know something. I'm not going to make myself smaller to make you more comfortable anymore. This is who I am now." She nodded slowly, and I could see her trying to adjust to this new version of me. The sister who took up space, who stated her boundaries clearly, who didn't apologize for her worth. Am I ready to move forward? Or is there still something I need to let go of? 6 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment, not bigger or fancier than my old one, but somehow it felt more spacious, because I filled it differently now. The walls were covered with photos from my tutoring students, certificates from the community college, where I'd started taking night classes, and yes, a framed picture from Grandma Rosa's 90th birthday party, where I'm laughing so hard my eyes are closed. I had just finished a call with Emma. We talked every few weeks now, careful conversations that were slowly building something new. She was in therapy, working through what she called her need to be the star of every show. I was proud of her for that work, but more importantly, I was proud of myself for not needing her to change in order for me to be okay. The truth was, my life looked almost exactly the same from the outside. I still worked at the diner, still tutored kids in the evenings, still lived in a modest apartment, and drove a car that made questionable noises. But everything felt different, because I felt different. I moved through my days like someone who belonged in her own life. Last week, one of my tutoring students, a shy girl named Anna who reminded me of my younger self, had finally mastered fractions after months of struggle. When she looked up at me with that spark of understanding in her eyes and said, "Ms. Rodriguez, you're the best teacher ever," I felt the same warm pride I'd experienced on that airplane. Not because someone else was validating me, but because I knew she was right. I was good at this. I was making a difference. The scholarship fund Grandma Rosa had established and my name had grown, and I'd been asked to join the selection committee. Reading applications from students who worked multiple jobs while pursuing their education, I saw myself reflected in their stories. But more than that, I saw their individual strength, their unique dreams, their inherent worth that had nothing to do with comparison to anyone else. Emma had asked me recently if I ever regretted that confrontation at Grandma's party, if I thought we could have found our way to a healthier relationship without all the drama. I'd thought about it for a long time before answering. "I don't regret standing up for myself," I told her. But I learned something important that night. The most powerful moment wasn't when I proved you wrong about me. It was when I finally proved myself right about me. As I sat in my apartment that evening, watching the sunset paint my walls golden, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about whether I was successful enough, pretty enough, or accomplished enough. Those questions had simply dissolved. Not because I'd achieved some external marker of worth, but because I'd stopped asking the wrong person for the answers. I thought about the woman who had stood in that airport terminal 6 months ago, clutching her boarding pass like a lifeline, desperate for validation. I felt such tenderness for her, such pride in how far she'd traveled. Not just to Miami and back, but to this place of quiet confidence, this home she'd built within herself. My phone buzzed with a text from Anna's mother. "Thank you for believing in my daughter. She told me she wants to be a teacher like you someday." I smiled, set the phone aside, and settled deeper into my chair. Tomorrow I would go to work at the diner, help Anna with her homework, attend my evening class, and call Grandma Rosa to check on her recovery from her recent hip surgery. These were not grand gestures or dramatic victories. They were simply the components of a life well lived, a life that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in 28 years, that was more than enough.
It was everything.